Good evening and welcome to this, our final of our In Detail series for RIAS Awards, which is an opportunity for us to hear and see more of some of the RIAS Award winners for 2022. This week we are looking at workplaces, and we have Quarry Studios and Lockerbie Sawmill. Both these are not just award-winning buildings, but they're also on our Doolan shortlist. So you'll be seeing more of them following this event, particularly as we're having some films made of both those buildings, so further opportunity after tonight to hear and see more about them. Now, I'm a big fan of both of these buildings. I think they're really exquisite examples and some of the best of Scottish architecture. Certainly Scottish architecture has to offer this year. Really exquisite in their detailing and what I would consider complete buildings, in that they've been considered at each level and each layer in each way. They share in common not just the fact that they're both workplaces, but they both have really quite unusual, complex and quite difficult sites to operate in. So I think we'll be hearing a lot today, both about the small scale of the detailing, the materiality, but also hopefully a little bit about some of those challenges, complexities and opportunities of working in those sorts of conditions. We're going to start this evening hearing from Konishi Gaffney from Konishi Gaffney and Lockerbie Sawmill, and then we'll move on to Ben Addy from Moxon Architects, apologies, talking about Quarry Studios. So I'll pass straight over to Kieran, but before I do, I'll just say please do add any questions as we go along in the Q&A, because once we've heard from both of our architects this evening, we will have a nice opportunity to have a discussion collectively. Over to you, Kieran.
Thank you, Tamsie. Hello, everyone. It's a bit odd speaking into the void of these things, but hope that's all right. So, yeah, so my name's Kieran Gaffney. I'm a director at Konishi Gaffney Architects. We're based in Edinburgh, and this project was for a client called James Jones and Sons, who are one of the UK's largest sawmillers. I've been asked to talk for 20 minutes, so I'll try and just sort of skim through the project, really. This is the site. This is the M74 heading north towards Glasgow, and this is the West Coast Main Line train line. And in between those two things is a big industrial estate, which includes, this is the James Jones site. There's another sawmill on the other side, and the Stevens Croft power station, which we'll come to. So this is looking at James Jones's site. This is the first picture they sent us when they invited us to be part of the project as a competition. There was 4 architects invited, and you were to come up with an idea, pitch, present that, and take it from there. This is the client's drawing. X marks the spot, sort of thing, and which I quite enjoyed. And so the sawmill yeah, we'll come to it in a minute in terms of how it works. Timber arrives in big piles, and it sort of goes through all these processes and then is shipped off again at this site. These things with steam coming off them are the drying kilns. This was their existing office. The sort of office for the whole sawmill was in this kind of weird log cabin, and they wanted to extend that. But for us, the interesting part was it wasn't just an office they wanted a visitor meeting space and a space for sort of, in effect, CPD. But it was for their clients, and their clients are people like Jewson and James Latham, those kind of suppliers of timber. So they had this important balance to have between making something good, but not looking too bling or too expensive, because the people who are arriving to look at that are saying, well, we're obviously overpaying you if it's got this amazing building. So they wanted to get this balance right, have a nuanced good, but not too good, interesting, but not too interesting. And I'll come to what was inside. So this is what happens. The logs arrive on site. You can see them here. There are lots of bark and loose, and they're taken through a processing onto a really sort of mechanized process, debarked. This machine was really interesting. And then in this room, there's lots of different, it does computer control cutting depending on the size of the logs and the species to get the right kind of products out. And you can see here planks. This might be, it looks like fence paneling, but you also get, this is a stack of 2x4s, which I found really interesting with the end grain. And so this is the kind of timber you would go to your local timber merchant and buy. And this has been kiln dried on site. Next door was Stevenscroft Eon. I think it's a biomass plant which is 44 megawatts of power, so enough for 70,000 homes, and all of that is powered by waste from the site. But they don't call it waste; they call it co-product. So it's not just James Jones, but their neighbours as well. There's a lot of kind of bark or chips or offcuts that are used. And the interesting thing about that is they use that in the kilns to dry the wood. So there's so yeah, it saves them a lot of energy basically. This is another of their buildings. Interestingly, they built this in half the time they built our little tiny office block. But this was the site. So the sort of unappealing, really, this photograph, sort of car park, lots of tarmac. Here's our industrial site, and this is the weighbridge, which is very important. So everything was weighed in and out. So you weigh in the wet wood and you weigh out the dried wood. This building was one of the challenges. It was an existing, we thought it was 1970s, but actually 2000. It was a kit timber oak, sorry, not oak, brown stained Norwegian wood cabin thing, which they had built. And this is our building here, which I'll explain in a bit. But one of our first things was, as you arrive in the site here, so this is the M74, there's a big A road here as well, and you arrive into the site, and we wanted to block the view of this because it was kind of an ugly office there. But we also wanted to, we did this thing where we offset these two volumes. So there's the two similarly length buildings, and we've offset them in order to indicate the front door. But also so this is the front door, and also to the upstairs has become this sort of meeting room and sort of visitor room, so that that room can have a view over. This is the sort of industrial site where all the logs arrive and things. So this is our plan. So as you can see, this is the existing office, and just the architect, just how the architecture is organised, it points to where the front of the door is. You can see it immediately as you come in, and the function is very simple. There's a few offices, one shared and 3 individual, one big sort of meeting room and reception, a meeting room at the back, and then sort of service spaces, a staff kitchen. This is the server room, energy, toilets and stairs up. And then the big room upstairs is a place for everyone to meet. So up to about 40 people for a meeting or a CPD. And there's a little place for kitchen and extra storage for chairs. Yeah, so these are the elevations, west and east. This is an existing office, and what we did is have a link building, an unheated link building, which linked between these two offices. What became quite important for us was this line that run through, and I'll come to that in a minute about detailing. This is the big window that faces east, out over the yard, and yeah, and this is the opposite side, the west-facing entrance building, so you can see it sort of guides people in. But this edge between the lower floor and upper floor, which continues in the link building over here, is very important. We were trying to get it as thin as possible. In this talk, I was going to show you sort of warts and all, like how we built things and why we built them. So I'll come to that straight away. So this is the reception space in construction. These are our individual offices, 3 of them, the bigger office at the end, and this is the link. We ended up with these kind of all of the timber we used in this building. Almost all of it was from the site, so it was from 100 meters away, and it was great. We got free access to lots of constructional timber, carcassing timber. But what we wanted to do was if I go back up, we wanted to keep this edge here as thin as possible. And so one of the ways we did that is have these incredibly tightly spaced rafters. So there are 200 centers, and there are 100 by 75 timbers. And that allowed us, you can see the section here, allowed us to keep a very thin edge in between these two volumes. One of the things we discovered was during the design stage was the window. This is the upstairs space, and the window out from that. Come back to that in a second. The window out looks over the yard, but that meant we had to make a very tall. The floor to floor height here is more than 4 meters, 4.2 meters. And the ceiling heights downstairs are about 3.1. So we had this big void space in between, which causes problems with the stairs getting up. There was lots of kind of issues around that. But yes, here's us we're demonstrating so that people who are coming to see the building are people who buy this stuff. And these are James Jones's proprietary I-joists. I'm sure everyone in the audience will have seen these. They're quite good engineered joists, very strong and lightweight. And we used them in an offset pattern like this to avoid cold bridging. So we ended up with a very thick 420mm thick walls, full insulated with wood wool, which gave us quite good U values, and no cold bridging. And we ended up with these cathedral ceilings with the I-joists offset staggered. We're also keen to show, this is one of the posts. This is larch, Douglas fir, a Douglas fir post, and this is me proving that it was structural, because here's the whole structure rests on top of this beam. We were trying to minimize the use of steel to show what timber could do. And this was an example of the span was a bit too big to do without a post, and so we used a Douglas fir post in the middle. It's a slightly blurry view, apologies from the outside. And this is the view as you arrive, so directing you into the entrance, but showing you that all of James Jones stuff is in behind. And a view from the other side, this is our link building, and this trying to get this line to run through, which became very important for us. We did a black base and a timber top, and part of that was this is CU finish, this kind of whitewashing effect you get, and we were trying to sort of minimize the height, because the thing that's just it's a bit, when you see this building in person, it's much bigger than it looks in photographs. Here's a person here, and you can, the floor to floor height is 4.2 meters. The actual ceiling, the actual floor height on the first floor is at this level. And this is the view out facing east over the wood arriving to the yard. And these, this isn't staged for the photograph. These lorries are arriving, every 10 minutes or so, one of these lorries arriving and leaving. And our detail at the corner. One of the issues was the way it's orientated. We wanted to see not just straight out, but actually look around the corner. One of the earlier iterations had this as a curved glass screen, and but again, I think we were getting that balance right between being too interesting and looking too expensive. So actually, we're quite pleased that it's got value engineered to being a square window. So internally, for us, it was like being in a toy shop. We could get as much wood as we like, any section we liked, any species that they produced, and we came up with this thing about making because how do you do something interesting but not too interesting internally? Douglas fir is quite pink, and you can see this is a bigger piece, and but we ended up taking the standard sizes. I think they were 170 by 40. We planed them all round, so we ended up with a 160 by 25. And we sort of like offset them, arrayed them away. And this was it in construction. We had a ridge beam, a glulam ridge beam, a glulam post, again to split the span, and these very densely spaced rafters. And this is the rafters coming down. We'll talk about the grills in a minute and the heating system. One of the interesting things was that these were able to be fixed through. We had a plywood top on top of these fins, and so each of the fins was fixed. The client was very concerned about where they weren't going to have any fixings, this is over the roof light, the big roof light that faces south. And so they did, the contractor was doing this, it wasn't a joinery contractor. They were the James Jones's normal kind of build their big sheds. So we had to sort of work within their expertise. They came up with this a dowel system that they glued in, and it just was just didn't work, didn't look good. So we and actually, because we had expected it to work, this is the same space with those dowels cut off, sanded back, and actually none of the timber is twisted despite being 25 mm thick, and that span is more than 4 meters. It's actually not twisting. So these are the fins on the outside. The fins cross this big roof light. This roof light was by Glazing Vision. One of the great things about a contractor like a client who's a kind of contractor is they've got big cranes on site anyway. So getting a big roof light in was just a no-brainer for them. I need to watch my time. I think I've got another 3 or 4 minutes, but I was going to explain what these things are. I saw something in the RIAS magazine, and it called these shark fin gills or shark gills. I've never heard them called that before, but what they are is intake and extract vents for the heating was an air source heat pump, which does cooling and heating, and there was a duct work that ran in the floor. These are I don't know if I was mentioning them before. There's grills in the main room upstairs. These are the grills, which we did in timber. It's quite a battle to get the detailing of that right. There's an oak floor, and that was the only non-softwood wood we had in the building, and it was the rest of the wood was supplied by James Jones. Yeah, so and then the grills were. This is a drawing which was produced looking at where the grills. This was hilariously wrong because this is where the grills were to be, so these all had to move over. But these were intake and extract grills, and they were very simple. We tried a few different things. And routed them out, had a mesh grill in behind. So yeah, so intake and extract, intake and 2 extract vents for the heating and for the ducts to the kitchen and bathrooms. And this is the internal view, and the post with our gripper marks, as it's in structural post. Oh, I've talked about this already, haven't I? Sorry, they're in twice. Then we used this repetition of fins we used on the wall as well, and clad these walls in Douglas fir using very small sections. And the door still, the rooms were getting the balance right between light. We wanted to get these are north-facing offices. The south-facing rooms were the kitchen and meeting room, and the offices had a bit more sort of indirect light. And the stair goes upstairs. I'll just finish on cladding. This was a lot of it was about getting a sort of carefully detailed finish, and so as I said, this edge was very important to us, and the gutter edge running round, and the cladding was also important. But the scale of the building is deceptive. You know, when you look outside, it looks like a house, but actually it's huge. The building's actually quite big. And this was us doing the cladding. So this is larch that James Jones produced. It had the CU finish. So after a few months, it whitewashes down to this kind of color. This is it going on. We did a block at the edges, and then we had black stained timber cladding at the ground floor. And yeah, and again, this thing about how do you position that window and to make the entrance. Okay, that was me finished. I don't know if I hand over to you, Tamsie.
Thank you, Kieran. It's always really interesting when you've stood in a building and then you see it presented through images. It doesn't, they never do it justice, but it's a very difficult building for people to go and pop by, not least because of its location. But thank you for sharing that with us.
Can I just add at this point one thing, Tamsie, which is that James Jones want to encourage architects to come to that building, or to come to that site, learn about timber, and they're doing a CPD thing soon. So if anyone is interested, then there might be some information about that soon.
That's great. You can organise some visits. So over to you, Ben, and your workplace.
Thank you very much, Tamsie. Is my screen share working before I?
It is.
It
yes.
is excellent.
We're looking at a lovely snowy scene.
A lovely snowy scene. So this is Loch which is a really wonderful mountain here on D side, and you can say that our studio in Crathy, which is tucked down in the glen in the foreground of this image, our studio sits in the shadow of Lochnagar. I was going to say my presentation today, I've only just put the slides together, so it's rather ad hoc in a way, but what I wanted to talk about was, I guess, my personal, some of my personal feelings about this project, because it is very personal to me and to everyone else in the practice here, more so than most projects, in fact. And that's really what I wanted to talk about, and in particular in response to landscape, before getting into the question and answer session, where any questions on the detail or what have you, I'd be very happy to talk about. So, like I say, this discussion now is really about what I feel about the project and what it means to me. So I'm going to start with some photographs of D side. So this is the Dee Valley, just between Crathy and Braemar, in the Eastern Cairngorms. It's a very special place for me. It's where I grew up, went to school, and fortunately was able to return here after setting up the practice in London, and I've now been living back here on D side for the last 10 years or so. It's a very special landscape, the Upper Dee, obviously Lochnagar, which you saw in the first image, but in general, it's a landscape of drumlin and esker. It's a glaciated, or it was a glaciated landscape. It's the product of thousands of years of glaciation, and that's reflected in all of the kind of the landform and the geomorphology that you see around, and of course also in the flora and indeed fauna. So this is a photograph just behind the site. You can see there's a tremendous amount of regeneration going on. The landscape of the Eastern Cairngorms is changing really dramatically as land use is changing, most notably on Marlodge Estate in the national park, but also here down in Crathy, and it's extraordinary to see. At the foot of the hill where this photograph was taken is the site. So this is just behind the site. It's this remarkable bit of birch woodland, like I say, within the landform of drumlin and esker. The kind of the moraines that were left behind, the detritus left by the glaciers as they retreated into the North Sea. So yeah, like I say, the project is very personal to me and my appreciation of this landscape. And this was back in 27th of September 2017. I think this was a day or two after we received consent from Aberdeenshire Council for our project, and it was again, personally speaking, one of the most important days of my professional career so far. And I think there are several reasons for that. I mean, as the headline makes clear, this is our own headquarters, so we are the client for this building. So when you take the sort of the usual triangle of client, architect, contractor, that relationship, clearly we're the architect. We're also the client, which is not an unusual position for an architect to be in. You can think of many architects who've become developer architects, or who have built their own studio, or typically fit out their own studio, what have you. This is not an unusual position to be in. Several years ago, though, when I moved to Scotland, or moved back to Scotland, I also established a small construction company together with my brother, who was he's a keen carpenter, keen joiner, and together we set up a small construction company. So this has meant that I've been in an extremely fortunate position to be both the architect and the client, but also the builder on this project, which has been, well, it is a kind of a dream scenario for many architects, I suppose, in that you can kind of close that loop, and I'm in contract, but I'm in contract with myself, which has eased things, but actually it makes things quite difficult at times as well, which I'd be really happy to elaborate on later on. So this is a slide that I normally use when I'm talking to students, so forgive the kind of the simplicity of it, but this is just putting the project in some context in terms of the development of the practice and then also the construction company. So you can see 3 different companies here on the left-hand side, and this is rather crude and yeah, dealing with kind of commercial matters, but you can see how the companies have grown, and it's the right-hand side of this image which has been the thing that has enabled us to be in this position where we are able to build our own premises. Basically, it's the savings of the practice that we have kind of accumulated over about a decade or so have been ploughed into this project. And there you can see the site. So this is the building about halfway through construction back in, I think, 2019. I think this photograph was taken, and this sort of leads on to. I mean, you can see here the main road. You can see Crathy Kirk, where the Queen goes to church, and then you can see, most importantly for me, the landform. So you can see the kind of the drumlin on the right hand side there, and you can see how the building is sitting into the bowl of a quarry that's being excavated from one of these larger drumlins. So the site was a brownfield site, originally used as a gravel and aggregate quarry for making roads and tracks, and then it was used as a tip. So it was a dump in the middle of this extraordinary landscape. Like I say, with the Queen next door, Aberdeenshire Council used it as a roads department's tip. So there's all sorts of peculiar and nasty things on the site, and we saw that our role here was not only to build the building and position ourselves on the site in a responsible way, but also to bring that landscape back into the middle of this site and to repair what happened to this place through the quarrying and also the dump, the tipping. So in terms of the design, I've picked on 3 things. They're all very much related to landscape. So 3 things about the design that are particularly important and personal to me. But there are many other things in the scheme that I'd be happy to talk about. The first of these things is the way in which the building is kind of embedded in the site. This is something very important to me and very important to the practice in general, particularly those of us working up here. The way in which buildings and bridges and other things that we get involved with are fixed in a site and become an intrinsic part of the site, such that they feel as if, ideally, they feel as if they've always meant to be there. Related to that very much is this idea of the building as a response to the landform. So this is, looking back at how that landform influences and determines the shape of the building, and then again related, the dialogue between that building, its internal and external spaces, and then how they relate to the wider site beyond. So these are things that obviously as architects we're always thinking about, but I think these are the things that in this project I've been particularly kind of focused on. So I'll just sort of take you through a few kind of simple diagrams. Here's the site. You can see the main road on the left-hand side there. It being a quarry, the access was very good for bringing vehicles in and out, extracting all that gravel. So we have a level access from the road, and you can see the kind of the characteristic bowl form up to the top end of the diagram there. And we kind of picked on one contour. So this is the escarpment contour. So this is where the bowl form is kind of the edge, the lip of the quarry, if you like. And very simply, we took the idea that we would try and position the large part of the building, so the studio space that I'm sitting in at the moment, back into that bowl form. But then we'd also have a more public aspect of the building on the main road, but something a little bit more tentative, certainly smaller, more diminutive part of the building. We would anchor these two components of the building around hearths, so around fireplaces that would be important both in terms of the internal organization of the structure, but also the way in which this building appears in its site. There's the kind of the three main functions on the site. So you can see the studio function with the computer and the desk, and then the cafe being the kind of the public part of the building. We also have a small workshop on the other side of the site, those two spanners. And there you go. There's the kind of the form and the volume that we're positioning. So you can see the cafe is significantly smaller than the studio, but they are very much related forms. They share obviously materials and the kind of construction and so forth, but also the way in which these spaces are organized in terms of the more public areas and the more private areas, and indeed the bathrooms and so on. They're basically siblings in terms of their plan arrangement and also their appearance, connected with a sheltered walkway beneath the same roof, which links those two buildings and importantly provides well, it provides all sorts of environmental benefits in terms of providing shading and what have you, but also provides a sort of a third space, an external but covered space that is extremely widely used both by people in the cafe and by the practice. And then there's the building sort of sitting in its site, the original drawings, and then I suppose part of the response was not only a formal response, but also going back to what I was saying about taking the flora of the surrounding woodland, which is a triple SI, so the juniper understory, and then the birch and the Scots pine and larch, and bringing that into the center of the site. So we're kind of repairing the site as much as possible. So there's a photograph of the cafe. This is just the business, what I was saying about this is the kind of the public face of the project. So this is the bit that you see from the roadside. The second aspect that I mentioned was the building as a response to the landform. So I guess some of those plan diagrams are already talking about that, but perhaps more literally, this is a cross section through the site. So on the left-hand side is the roadway, and then on the right-hand side, you're looking back into the bowl of the quarry. And again, very simply, that's an approximation of that contour line that I was talking about, the escarpment of the quarry. And we very simply replicated that in the form of the building roof. So we're not only pushing that right-hand larger part back into the bowl, but we're also very consciously scribing that line, much as a joiner might scribe a line, following a reference. We're following that reference, and we're deriving our roof form from that. We then set a datum for the lowest point on the building and allow that to generate the geometry of the roof. And there we are. We have this sort of wonderful situation in the building where we're sitting so low down relative to the top edge of the quarry that the woodland is at least 2 or 3 stories above the top of the building. So this really helps to situate the building, and I guess that's, like I say, a very important part of the generation of the plan form and the section. So there's a construction photograph which probably best expresses that. So you can see how the quarry lip is sort of comes around sort of more or less horizontally and then starts to dip down behind the chimney there. And then this is a cross section looking in the other direction through the site. So again, the quarry lip on the right hand side. But what we're showing here is how the cross section of the building also helps to sort of situate the architecture into the site, but also minimize the apparent scale of the building. This is something that's quite difficult, much like Kieran's project. Actually, it's quite difficult to explain some of these things without actually walking around the site and seeing the building. But the form of the building has been quite carefully configured so that the mono pitch of the main space is set, the pitch of that roof is set such that if you stand in the public area of the site, you're looking up the pitch, which means you don't get an appreciation for the scale of the studio building. So when you come into the site, you see the cafe, and you can understand the cafe because you can see it more or less in the round as you come in off the road. But the studio is set back into the bowl, and through this kind of trick, when you see both buildings together, they both look around about the same size. But in actual fact, the studio building is about 7 or 8 times larger than the cafe, and we knew that was always going to be the case. So it's a sort of a balancing act, if you like, in terms of ensuring that the studio is not overbearing, both in terms of its relationship with the public part of the site, but also in terms of its relationship with the wider area. It's quite a visible site. Like I mentioned some of our neighbours earlier on, we need to be considerate of, but you know, the landscape is the most important thing here, and we wanted our building to not sort of compete with that. And there you can see the cross section through the building, and then these photographs kind of quite neatly express that cross section. So you can see that we're sort of tucked into that pocket in the landscape. That cross section also allows us to create an entirely private space to the rear of the studio building, where we've got a roof terrace, which we're starting to hold events on this roof terrace. So supper clubs. The cafe is proving to be quite successful. So we're now running evening events, and people can come up onto the roof terrace, have their dinner and what have you. But you can see the clear story windows that look back down into the studio. So there's a really lovely relationship between people coming to the cafe or these supper club events and seeing the building. And I mean, not a day goes by without people sort of peering through the window at us and wondering what we're doing. What they don't often realize is that our windows one of the windows is wide open, so we can hear everything they say about us as they're peering in. Generally positive. And then here's the internal space. So there's the kind of clear story window on the right hand side that I was talking about, and this really lovely lovely moment in the building where you look through that window and you see not the tops of trees, but actually you see the bottoms of the trees as they sort of climb up the hillside behind the studio. And then thirdly, and kind of finally, in terms of that relationship with landscape, it's this the dialogue between the internal and external spaces that are defined by the plan with the wider landscape, so with the wider site. So I've picked out a couple of those key spaces here and just sort of toned them up. Each of these spaces has both a very particular use function within the building, and I can sort of go through them all, but and a particular form, and we're trying to create a particular kind of condition. So in the main studio space in the middle here, it's the largest space in the building. This is where we have the greatest amount of connection with the exterior in terms of the biggest views, if you like. So there's off to the pond and the wild area in the center of the site on one side, and then up through the clear story windows to the bases of the trees I was talking about a moment ago. But then all these subsidiary spaces around the studio have their own kind of corresponding private garden. So there's the clear story with the base of the trees as they climb up the hill. Here's we've got a kind of a informal meeting room and the space for a drawing board. It has its own private kind of shaded garden. This photograph was taken just after we completed, so the garden's now full of ferns and anemones and what have you. The meeting room, the main meeting room, has a very low window. It's sort of around about chest height when you come into the room, but obviously it's sort of the inverse of a Victorian classroom where the windows were very high. The window here is very low, so it only addresses people who are in the meeting. And then we have these various pockets of space around the building for log storage and external sheltered seating and what have you. It's about creating as many kind of different opportunities, both for the practice and myself and my colleagues, but then also the public who come to the cafe and then tend to sort of range freely around the building, exploring it all, which is rather lovely and yeah, very welcome. We didn't expect it, but people are quite bold, and it's quite good, quite fun. And I think this photograph, I'm going to end now really, this photograph really sort of demonstrates again what is key for us, which is the preeminence and the importance of the landscape over the building. The building is expressed through detail and what have you, but it's generally the background, and it's all about, like I say, the repair of the site, tying it back into its surroundings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. I noticed you called it Quarry Studios more poetically than Tip Studios. Yeah, probably the right way around.
Yeah.
I think we're getting some questions, but there are a few themes I was quite interested in picking up with the two of you before we do. The first, maybe a bit prosaically, is about the relationship with the contractor, or maybe in Kieran's case, the contractor, but also you're working with a wood supplier who are very keen for you to use the product. And obviously, Ben, you were working for yourself, working with yourself. So it would be interesting just to reflect a little bit more on those two slightly unusual, but perhaps more fruitful relationships. Kieran, can we start with you?
Yeah, well, I think we had two different contractors. We had the building contractor who was, as I said, he was used to building big steel sheds and not used to actually building in timber, strangely. You know, they did all their industrial buildings and lots of concrete, and that made it quite difficult. They had a subcontractor who was a joiner, but he was not, I mean, we had to work with them to get the finishes we wanted. But on the other side, the client themselves knew everything there was to know about their product, you know, so we couldn't tell them anything. We couldn't say, you know, you can't use larch there. They would, because they knew exactly what you could use. And so it was quite a mix, you know, it was sort of it was actually a challenge, quite a battle. I mean, I would love to have been in Ben's case where, you know, it was me building the building, or my brother even, you know, building the building would be great. Because I've done that thing where I built my own house and I was the contractor, and I like Ben says, I know what that feels like. It's great, you've got control. It's much more difficult when you've got a contractor who's not used to dealing with architects. And this contractor actually found us to be, he found us to be weird. He was like, who's this guy? He just wasn't used to people caring about what the handrail looked like, or, you know, that kind of thing. So I mean, everybody knows what that feels like. That's a normal project, isn't it? Everyone knows that.
Ben.
So what was the question? So what's it like being the relationship with a contractor? Or?
Just an unusual contractor client relationship. And I suppose the question to you is almost the opposite. It's how do you control cost? How do you hold both of those, wear both of those hats at the same time? How do you control yourself?
You're sort of you are split completely, and it can be quite confusing at times. I don't know. I mean, I think what was particularly wonderful about this project, and we've had some of it on some earlier projects where we have been the architect and the contractor, is that just what Kieran was saying, the level of control, and actually it's the experience of working with individual joiners and what have you on site to achieve certain things becomes very, very kind of relaxed. And I think it's probably quite an old-fashioned way of working. It's not, you know, it's something that I think used to be very common and is much less common now. And the only reason we've been able to work in that manner, sort of hands-on with the joiners and whoever else on site, is that I own the construction company, and that's the only reason that I've been able to do it. And it's been wonderful. I mean, there's various things in terms of, you mentioned cost. I mean, the flip side of cost is always the risk. And I took several quite large risks with the project. So a good example being the concrete chimneys. We could have gone to a specialist concrete contractor, and we very nearly did go with one. But in the end, I decided that, you know, through discussion with my colleagues, the joiners and what have you on site, that we would try it ourselves. And if it failed, then it would be a bit of an expensive mistake, but we'd be able to rectify it, hopefully. But in the end, it worked. And there's only one part of the formwork. If you imagine a 2-story high piece of concrete forming the main chimney in the studio, I mean, the hydrostatic pressure on that is absolutely gigantic for the first few hours on the formwork. And a bit of the formwork did fail, but it was a bit where it was never going to be on show, so it didn't matter. So there's a big sort of bellying in the concrete in one of the hidden walls. But we saved ourselves probably about 75% of the cost of a specialist contractor. So you can do things like that. I mean, another good example is the primary steel work. We went to steel fabricators that a contractor would normally go to, but we also went to a barn supplier, an agricultural barn supplier, and we said that we would, instead of expecting them to produce their connection details, we would do it all. We'd give them full set of steel fabrication drawings, take all of the risk ourselves, and we procured all our steel work for, I think it was about £30,000 rather than 70. So, you know, there are things that you can do to help with the cost.
Thank you. One of the things that struck me going around both those buildings with the two of you is both of you did a very good job of snagging them for the judges and pointing out everything that you thought was wrong. Down to, I think Kieran was pointing out alignments of nails that he wasn't particularly happy with at one, which is very enjoyable. But I think it'd be interesting to explore with you both that kind of really intimate relationship both of you seem to have with the building and the detail that went into that. It felt very much that literally every nail, every element. I remember you, Ben, telling us about your wooden sets that you have outside with great love and detail.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to hear from both of you a little bit more about that relationship with the detail. Kieran, do you want to go first?
Yeah, well, we had some simple details in a way, so we just had to get them right, you know. So our building, I mean, unlike Ben's, ours is really plonked down because there wasn't anything we could do with that landscape. You know, there's a car park and paving, and so, and it's, you know, I often look at other people's buildings and think, oh, I wish I had that opportunity, or I wish I had that, you know, especially when you see those buildings in Sky and you think, God, if only you could put anything you like in that site, you know, it'd look great, you know. But yeah, in terms of our details, it's kind of a bit of patience, isn't it? And I think it helps to know what it's like to build. I think contractors generally are open to you telling them how to do it if you know what you're talking about a little bit, or at least if you know what it feels like to be them. Because you know, Ben's talked about the risk about money, and it's a huge risk for contractors. And what they don't like is architects turning them up and telling them, change that, do this, do that, without appreciating their risk, you know, and their problems. And so we try to be sensitive to that. We try to be on their side. We try not to condemn things and say that needs to be taken down or something like that. I mean, that's a general approach. And the trick to that is to be there all the time. Now, the problem for us on this project was it was 2 hours away. It was difficult to be there a lot. And I guess, Ben, I'm sure you'll have been there every day, and so it would have been easier to do that. And yeah, I mean, that's the hard thing. It's anyone can design good stuff. It's building good stuff that's hard. Yes.
Yeah.
I'd agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not anyone can design good stuff,
Yeah.
right? But I know what you mean. As a figure of speech, I'd agree. I mean, I think I mean, Tamsie, you mentioned the timber sets outside, and there's a lovely wee near link between the two projects in that we originally, so those sets, the timber cobbles outside, are the offcuts from this great big timber wall that you can see behind me. The offcuts from that became the external wearing surface. We procured all of this timber, which is all Douglas fir. We tried to buy it from Jimmy Jones. Actually, they have a sawmill at Glentana, which is very, very close to us. And they gave us a price, and it was a reasonable price. But we thought we'd try and get a check price. So we went to a small local sawmill up in, well, less local actually, but up in Forres, Lockerbie Sawmill, and they do brilliant stuff. I'd recommend people check them out. And they gave us a price, and it was a healthy 30 or 40% cheaper. So obviously we went with them. When they delivered the timber, we asked them where they got it from, and they said, "Oh, we got it from Jimmy Jones at Glen Tanner." So quite how they managed to acquire it cheaper and still maintain that low cost for us, I don't know. But what got even lovelier is that the Douglas fir was actually felled from a garden in Burse. So this was actually my next door neighbor growing up just outside of Boyne. So I probably climbed in these trees when I was a kid. I don't know where this is going, but anyway, it's you find when you're, like I say, when you're working as the contractor as well, you get so involved in the procurement, and so much of what makes a good building is in the procurement and where things are sourced, and as Kieran says, you know, the level of control that you can have, and appreciating what the contractor's going through can really assist in those conversations.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think I'm not quite sure on the correct words, but I'd agree with the sentiment that, you know, a good architect can design a good building, but a really good architect can then get a good building built. And there's a different set of skills there. Very interesting. So one more question for me before we move on, which is the scale. Scale is a big thing for both of you. You've got relatively small buildings. I mean, the office you're in, Ben, has some scale to it, but they're still relatively modest buildings in pretty impressive large scale settings, albeit Ben's has the kind of the shelter of the quarry. And I just wanted to explore that, I think, a little bit more about these little jewels in quite robust landscapes. Kieran, yours is the most robust of the landscapes, and quite startling, I think, the contrast as you drive up to it, and particularly when you sort of stand outside and you look, there's motorway one side of you and a sort of giant industrial plant on the other.
Yeah, that's hard, isn't it? I mean, it was hard. We found that quite difficult. I mean, we ended up with something that looked like it could be a house, but part of that was because of the nature of the timber we were using. So it was quite kind of C16 timbers, and we didn't want to have big spans and lots of posts. So we ended up with a house-shaped volumes with pitched roofs and things. And in a way, we spent a bit of time wondering if that was the right answer there, because everything else is low pitch and very big spans and big, huge buildings. I don't know if we got that right. I mean, I think it does feel a bit different from everything else. And I mean, it does feel, when you see these aerial photographs of it in the site, you just think, gosh, it's really dwarfed by everything, you know. But I think when you get up to the building, that's when people really care what the building is when you're touching it and feeling it. And, so yeah, we struggled with the scale, struggled with that site. You know, it's quite in a way, I was quite excited by the project when it was pitched to me, and they talked about a visitor centre, and that sounds like amazing. And then you got there, and it was like quite an industrial setting. So, but yeah, that was our site. It was an unusual site.
It's kind of, I think they're both quite magical in very different ways. Well, that was my takeaway from visiting both of those sites. There's just a different kind of magic.
Yeah, Ben sounds much lovelier.
Well, I won't deny the fact that the surroundings here are absolutely exquisite. I mean, it's an amazing piece of landscape, both the immediate landscape around the studio, you know, beyond Aberdeenshire Road Department's tip. It's utterly beautiful, and really kind of it's a really tightly woven landscape. I mean, I was talking about the Eskers and what have you, but you know, these are land formations that are incredibly sort of pronounced in a very small geographic space, and so the building is sort of sitting in okay, it's a quarry, but effectively it's still within this kind of knotted, threaded landscape. I mean, the building is a radical departure from any other building around here. I mean, the buildings that it is similar to in some ways are those agricultural barns and things. You know, that's where the antecedent is. But really it's been designed in a way from sort of first principles as a response to landscape and response to that woven, knitted bit of glaciated landscape that we're sitting in. So you don't, I mean, actually where it's similar to Kieran's, I think, is that it is in the detail that people start to appreciate it, as you say. Yeah.
Yeah, I see lots of similarities. I think perhaps the pair of you see them as quite different, but having stood in both of them, I see quite a lot of parallels.
I'm looking forward to seeing. I haven't been to Kieran's one, so I'm really looking forward to seeing it, because, yeah, I mean, I think certainly from the photographs you can see, real consideration for detail and some playfulness in the detail as well, which I really love. So yeah, and I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Well, Supper Club and your thing sounds great then.
There you go.
Come to you first.
Oh, open invite. Yeah.
Yeah, we should be doing some RIAS architectural tours, really.
Yeah, definitely.
Just moving on to some of the questions that we've been asked. They're showing as anonymous, so I'm afraid I can't credit the person who's asking them. But I'd like to ask you both the first one, maybe a little bit more broadly than the question, but as someone says, our RIAS convention this year, the theme is on value. And I suppose going to you, Ben, first, more specifically to their question, and then maybe Kieran, you can take the question a bit more broadly about what you think the value is of an architect working in a designed space, or perhaps a self-designed space.
Self-designed space. Well, so it's probably difficult for me to be critical about this, because I'm so close to the project, and as Kieran mentioned, I was on site pretty much every single day while it was under construction. So I sort of know each bit of it like the back of my hand. I know all the foibles and all the rest of it. So I suppose the drawback is knowing precisely where things have, had to be changed on site. But in terms of the value of working in a space like this, I mean, so we have this kind of straightforward value in terms of potential clients and members of the public visiting the building. I mean, it's a very heavily used building now. I mean, there are only, 8 of us or so working in the studio at the moment. But we have probably around about 60, 70, 80 people most days coming to the site using the cafe. And then at weekends, there's a parking on the other side of the road. You end up with, we have very many people coming through the doors of the cafe, and very often they wander around the building, they go onto the roof terrace, they look at the work in the studio that might be on display. So the value is quite obvious. I mean, we've received commissions off the back of having the building, and also the engagement that we have with the community around here, both through having the cafe, but also being so accessible to the community. It's a community that probably it doesn't use architects much, and yet they can come in and people use our meeting room. We sort of provide it pro bono to various local organizations, and use the facilities here and all the rest of it. So I think there's this huge value for us, obviously, but then I think there's value to the community beyond us, and that's something that we're looking to expand in the future as well.
Kieran.
I think it's interesting, Ben. I've heard you talk in the past about the detailing and getting the detailing right, and because it would reflect badly on you as well.
Yeah.
And I wonder. My question to you was about that. Like, is there a risk that because this happened to us at James Jones? They said, our clients are juicing, and these big kind of. They don't want a really beautiful building. They want it basic, and sort of. Were you worried about that at all? I mean, the flip side of the thing you'd said before.
Yeah.
Or is that just good? It's good to be expensive.
Well, no, I know what you mean, because a very close friend of mine, architect, that I used to work with, always used to say, "Don't turn up to a meeting with a nice watch." I mean, I don't really have a nice watch, but he had some nice watches, but he always took them off. And I think it's that same sort of principle. I mean, I mean, we can talk about the kind of the financial side of this. I mean, this isn't a particularly expensive building, but a huge amount of care has gone into certain aspects that are very visible. I mean, the overall cost, it was it was £1 million pretty much on the nose, which if you break it down is £2.5 a square meter or thereabouts. But within that cost is furniture, fit out, landscape, the remedial work that we did to the landscape to get rid of a load of the kind of horrible stuff that was here. So there's a lot in that cost that wouldn't necessarily always be in a square meter rate. So I think I can always quite confidently and comfortably point to that, that actually and okay, the Douglas fir, I explained the story behind that. The concrete was, we got a economy on that, economy on the steel work. Actually all the effort going into the design and the detailing is where that value comes through, and it needn't be expensive materials that you're working with. Definitely not. So I think that the value, I mean, in a way I'm glad that you think it was expensive, Tamsie. It wasn't, and it took a long time. So I suppose the other triangle is cost, quality, time, and we controlled the cost very well, we controlled the quality very well, and time was in the lap of the gods.
And for you, Kieran, one of the questions that people have asked is the kind of the cost per square meter. Are you able to say anything about the Sawmill? I know.
Yeah, I mean, they got a lot of timber for free. So that's one thing. But I think in reality, it's probably not a huge cost. The timber maybe they would have spent £100,000 on that cost. Their construction budget when they came to us was 600. We tender came back at 850, and we got it down to 760. So, but that there is a lot of, maybe we've been about £1 million as well. I can't actually remember how big it was, but so I don't exactly know the rate. My guess is probably quite similar to Ben's £2,500 a square meter, that kind of price. It was quite a simple building. Our big costs were the big roof light. It was quite a 4 meters by 2 meters, quite an expensive roof light, and timber cladding. Timber flooring from Rosswood. Everything else was. Yeah, the windows were Velvac windows. They're all quite sort of simple system things, So, I think it was good value for them, for the client. And they, interestingly, the people who actually use the building, people who work in the building, all of them were totally uninterested in the building until they moved in, and suddenly they were like, oh wow, this is actually quite good. They were all busy, health and safety people and managers of the system of. They were used to working in porta cabins. They really didn't care about their space. But they now all talk about how they like it.
So. I'd absolutely reinforce that, Kieran, with the experience here with people coming to the building, like I say, the cafe and whatnot, wandering around, people who don't experience, or obviously everyone experiences architecture and buildings and what have you in their daily lives, but don't really engage with it. But people come here who don't typically engage with it and really engage with it, and it's really remarkable. And I think that's the thing that I most enjoy about the building, is other people's reactions to it, and particularly those people who aren't architects coming for a little look. It's people who've just happened upon the place, have a cup of coffee, and they're like, look at that gutter. And
I suppose that's something that links. That's another thing that links these two projects. In a way, I suppose the brief to Kieran was to deliver something that's special and different in a site that's full of metal sheds, off the peg metal sheds. Do you think you've achieved that as well, Kieran?
Oh, that's to me.
Do you think you've got people to engage in a different way?
Yes, and I mean, a lot of it is about materials. I think people engage with wood in a way which is quite intrinsic, but they have a feeling for wood and they touch it, and there's so much wood in that building. It's quite a comfortable space to be in, sort of. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'd say that, wouldn't I? But I mean, it's quite hard. I mean, I've only been 3 or 4 times since they moved in, but I do hear that they like the building, and I think visitors I don't think people walk in and go, oh my God, they don't do that. And that's good, because that's not what the plan was. The plan was this, simple, it's kind of clean, and it sets up the view around this walk around the rest of the site, you know. So yeah, so it's getting that balance. I mean, a lot of our work's like that, getting that balance right, not necessarily being too good, you know, good but not that good, you know, sort of thing, you know.
Well, we really stuck you in it then by giving you some awards and shortlisting you for the best building in Scotland.
Well, they all fell off their seats. The clients couldn't believe it.
We've had a comment in £1 million investment in Aberdeenshire is quite a lot. I don't know if that's a comment on the investment or Aberdeenshire in that context.
Yeah.
Racist comment there, was it?
Aberdeenshire is a very special place. No, but yeah, no, it's a. I probably shouldn't go any further. Actually, no, it's an interesting place, Aberdeenshire. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I suppose before we wrap up, there's kind of I want to ask you, I suppose, the awkward question, which is there anything that either of you would have done differently? Oh, there's thoughtful faces.
I think, okay, I'll tell you mine. Mine was the concrete slab. So we did that for the RIAS Awards. We did the energy embodied carbon calculation, and 41% was in this concrete slab. And so we're moving away from slabs in general. I think everyone is, and we would do that differently. We would, because we were worried about the site because there's a lot of water there, and we thought it would be quite good to get a slab down and protect it and raft and stuff. But in hindsight, we should have had much less concrete.
Yeah.
Ben's still thinking.
I'm still thinking. Yeah, I mean, originally in the scheme, actually, when we first were kind of developing the design in the early stages, we had more concrete in the scheme. The mass timber walls that I was talking about, a lot of that was concrete at one point in our minds, because we were, you know, very much focused on discussions about energy in use and acquiring, you know, making sure there was sufficient thermal mass in the building, because we knew we were going to put a ground source heat pump in, which we do have to the back. It goes down 1/4 kilometer into granite and delivers at least 50% of all the energy used in the entire complex comes from the ground source. So that's cookers, computers, everything else. You know, half the demand is free out of the ground. So we were very worried about ensuring there was thermal mass, because we knew it was going to be a largely timber frame building with the big spans in steel. And so we got rid of the concrete. I think, yeah, on reflection, probably similar to Kieran, we would have investigated using engineered timber, so, you know, glulam and CLT and what have you, for achieving our long spans. We'd have needed to do something to maintain the thermal mass. I don't know what we would have done, but I think, yeah, I think it's the use of structural timber. I mean, around about the same time as we started this project, we were finishing Cairngorm National Park headquarters, which is entirely CLT. And we've got other projects now that are entirely engineered timber. Interesting, as Kieran was saying, we're lifting buildings off the ground to avoid the use of much concrete in the foundations. You know, it's using a couple of piles and things, and that's something, yeah, again, that we would have investigated, I think. Yeah.
I wondered if you might say something about the balance between the two buildings, simply because the cafe is so successful now.
Yeah, I was
yeah.
going to ask that. You should swap.
Yeah. So we have this workshop across on the other side of the site, which follows the same sort of considerations as the main building. You know, it's doing the same thing. It's just a simpler form. And, you know, we had lovely designs on that being, as in plans, on that being, you know, workshop. We'd eventually put some model making equipment in there, some CNC machines or what have you. But the whole place has been taken over by the cafe. So they've put a new kitchen in there. They've completely racked out the big space and filled it with, you know, whatever supplies. And they're now commandeering the roof terrace. Yeah, they've taken over.
It is very good. I can highly recommend it.
No, I mean, they're wonderful. I mean, I think what Tom and Caitlin, who run the cafe, do is absolutely extraordinary. And probably, you know, if the architecture of the building is a curio for people in the area, then certainly the food that they produce is even more so. it's yeah, fabulous.
Yeah. Well, we're drawing to the end of our time. So I think we've answered all the questions. Some Rick, congratulating you both on your designs, and I would definitely like to echo that and thank you both for joining us this evening. As I said, both buildings are shortlisted as well for the Doolin Prize, and as such, we will be making films in the next few weeks of both buildings, and those will be available within a month or so, and so will enable people to perhaps reflect a little bit on some of the things we've talked about and see the buildings a little bit more in their settings. I think we're getting some drone footage so we can see them in those impressive landscapes. So please do look out for those and have a look when they go forward, and best of luck to both of you and the jury visits and the announcement of the Doolin, which will be on the 30th of November. So it's something for you all to look out for. But thank you both for joining us here tonight, for sharing your stories of both of those buildings, and for bringing our In Detail series to a close. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us.